just kind of consider, slurry should be treated like chemical fertilizer. Would you go out whenever you decide to spread your slurry and lash out a heap of chemical fertilizer earlier in the year? You probably wouldn't because of the price of it. And the same too should be taken into consideration with slurry. So obviously, if you have the contractor in, just consider, maybe drop the tank 3 or 4 feet, give yourself a bit of capacity to get cattle out the grass, and maybe then spread slurry kind of later in the season again.
Hello and welcome to The Beef Edge, the Teagasc Beef Podcast, for all your latest news, information and advice for Irish beef farmers. I'm Catherine Egan, and on this week's episode, I'm joined by Teagasc Cattle Specialist Niall Kerins to get an update on the nutrient management legislation and developing a nutrient management plan for your farm. Niall, you're very welcome. The Nitrates Action Programme underwent a number of changes last year, with stronger measures introduced for protection of water quality. What were the main changes, Niall?
I suppose the main changes that have come into play, that affect dry stock farmers that might be listening here in relation to NICE regulation would be that every farmer in the country ideally should have a nutrient management plan, but in particular those farmers that are greater than 130 kgs of organic nitrogen per hectare. So those farmers that are stocked higher than 130 kgs of organic nitrogen per hectare need to have a nutrient management plan. And if they don't, I suppose, essentially what it means is you don't have a phosphorus allowance. And a lot of fertilizers on dry stock farms, that are purchased on a yearly basis would have some level of phosphorus in them. So, if you don't have soil samples in place or a nutrient management plan in place, you could very well be exceeding the limits without realizing it. I suppose the next thing really, is in relation to the fertilizer open dates and close periods or whatever. So I suppose in terms of chemical fertilizer, the bag fertilizer that's bought on farms, depending what zone you're in the country, whether it's zone A, B or C, for those farmers that are in zone A, from the 26th of January onwards, they can spread fertilizer. For zone B, from the 29th of January onwards, they can spread chemical fertilizer. And lastly, then in zone C, they can spread chemical fertilizer from the 14th of February. And obviously those dates have changed from maybe a couple of years back when primarily it was kind of from mid-January onwards, they could spread chemical fertilizer. So they have been pushed back, a duration of time, I suppose, again, depending what part of the country you're farming in. And the same then, I suppose, on the other side, this time of the year, slurry is a big, I suppose, is a big job on farms. And again, there is dates to bear in mind. So for farmers in zone A, they can spread slurry from the 13th of January onwards. For zone B, it's the 16th of January onwards. And lastly, then for zone C, they can spread slurry from the 1st of February. So it's very, very important, depending what part of the country you're farming in, that you, I suppose, you make yourself aware, I suppose, in terms of what zone you're farming in, and stick to those deadlines and those criteria, because you could catch yourself out if you happen to be spreading slurry or spreading chemical fertilizer, and the zone is still closed in your area. So I suppose they are kind of the main things catching that are affecting dry stock farmers. There is, I suppose, other measures that will be affecting more dairy farmers than dry stock farmers. And I suppose to reiterate, the big thing really is to having soil samples in place. And for those farmers that are stocked greater than 130 kgs of organic nitrogen per hectare in 2024, all slurry on their farms needs to be spread by low emission slurry spreading equipment. I think that one. All slurry on their farms needs to be spread through less in 2024. So it does.
And you mentioned there the importance of having the soil samples for farmers that are interested in taking soil samples and maybe need to update theirs. How do they go about taking soil samples?
Yeah, so I suppose look at a soil sample really is a sample taken on about 10 acres of land, okay, and it's valid for 4 years. So how you go to take it, either A, you might get your advisor to organise a soil sampler call out show when they're in your area, or B, you go and soil sample it yourself. So as I say, it's valid for 4 years. So if there are soil samples taken the last, 2 or 3 years, or back as far as 4 years, you could get your nutrient management plan updated to identify what your nitrogen and phosphorus limits might be. Look, soil sampling is cheap. It works out about 15 cents an acre when you kind of divide it across 3 or 4 years. And as I say, for 10 acres, it's not a whole lot. But I suppose the big thing really, no matter what size of farmer you are, whether you're heavily stocked or lowly stocked, you need to know your nitrogen and your phosphorus limits, because there is limits there. And I suppose, again, as I said earlier on, if you are buying in fertilizer, primarily on dry stock farmers, they are bringing in some level of nitrogen and phosphorus in chemical form, and you could very well be exceed your limits without having a soil sample or without having a nutrient management plan in place. So it is important to find out where you are and get soil samples taken before slurry is spread. This time time of the year is ideal for taking soil samples because land might never shouldn't have any, I suppose, shouldn't have received any chemical fertilizer or slurry for the last 3 or 4 months. And just before slurry season kicks off, it's a good time to identify where your P and K levels are going into the 2024 season. And again, there can be savings made on farms based on these soil test results. We'll say, for example, if fields come back very high in phosphorus and potassium and fields that are very low, there might be options to move slurries around within the farm and try to apply it in fields that need it more compared to others. I suppose from there, then, what will a soil sample tell you? It'll also tell you your pH or your lime requirement on farms. And I suppose traditionally on dry stock farms, really, Catherine, I suppose in terms of soil fertility, kind of nationally on dry stock farms, between 50 to 60% of farms across the country are suboptimal for pH, which basically means they're lacking lime. Okay, for phosphorus levels then on these dry stock farms, again, it's something similar, kind of between 50 to 60% of farms are at index 1 or index 2 for phosphorus, and it's a similar enough trend in for potassium. Roughly speaking, about 50% farmers are at index 1 and index 2 for potassium, so they are suboptimal for soil fertility. And I suppose the essence really is, be it, on dry stock farms, grazing is taking place and silage harvest is going to take place later in the season. Now, I know weather has a huge impact on grass growth, but so too does soil fertility. They nearly go hand in hand. And we often hear Catherine, I suppose, on the ground talking to farmers, that grass growth is back, silage yield is back. But fundamentally, out putting weather aside, soil fertility, it plays a huge issue on these, plays a huge role on these farms. And it is important, to establish what way you are and make improvements on your farm going forward, especially if you are seeing silage yield suffering or grass growth suffering as a result. So I suppose that's really kind of where we are at the moment, Catherine.
And you mentioned there, Niall, really about maximising the nutrients within slurry. How can farmers best maximise the value of the slurry nutrients?
Yeah, so I suppose, first of all, to establish what's in slurry, take a slurry test result could be beneficial. Okay, and like realistically speaking, taking a sample of slurry that's out of shed A within the yard. Traditionally speaking, the same shed is used year in, year out. We'll say whether it was for finishing cattle or whether it was for suckler cows, for example. So if you've got a kind of an accurate representation of these sheds or specific sheds within the yard, you can take the dim results are kind of accurate from for the next couple of years if it's the same if the same group of stock inside the shed year in, year out. So just for example, for a slurry test result there from a future beef farmer who's working with Teagasc, a suckler farmer, a slurry test result there seen there recently, for 1,000 gallons of slurry, what is in 1,000 gallons of slurry in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. And roughly speaking, if this slurry is put out in the springtime through low emission slurry spreading equipment, you're looking at about 9 units of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons, about 6 units of phosphorus and about 27 units of potassium. So that's the nutrient component that could potentially be in cattle slurry. But it would be a good idea, to test your slurry and see what's in it and go from there. And most labs that you find around the country that are testing soil might also be able to test slurry for you. I suppose what fields to target on really, I suppose silage ground predominantly has a massive requirement for phosphorus and potassium compared to grazing ground, because in grazing ground you will have a bit of nutrient recycling going on, because obviously the cattle are grazing, they're going to be dunging or urining, within the field, and they're going to be recycling some of the nutrients that might potentially be taken off. But silage ground has a massive demand for phosphorus and potassium, and what we often see when soil samples are taken, the silage ground sometimes could be at index 1, index 2, simply because sometimes the nutrients that are taken off aren't being replaced. And I suppose in previous years I would have seen myself, dealing with farmers where in the grazing block it might have been, index 3, index 2, index 3, and and then a specific year when they take soil samples, it might have dropped back to index 1, and more often than not, that sometimes can result in silage being taken off and the slurry not going back out to replace the nutrients you take off. So, I suppose I target the silage ground, and I'd also obviously target ground, that might be at index 1, index 2, kind of across the farm. And, this time of the year, we spoke about the open period there and when you can spread slurry and stuff. This time of the year, tanks are going to be full in farms, which is kind of obvious, especially if animals have been housed since last October or September, depending where it is. Just kind of consider, slurry should be treated like chemical fertilizer. Would you go out whenever you decide to spread your slurry and lash out a heap of chemical fertilizer earlier in the year? You probably wouldn't, because of the price of it. And the same too should be taken into consideration with slurry. We discussed there the nutrient component of slurry, what it has in terms of in P and K. So obviously, if you have the contractor in, just consider, maybe just take out, I don't know, drop the tank 3 or 4 feet, give yourself a bit of capacity to get cattle out the grass, and maybe then spread slurry kind of later in the season again. And use slurry wisely, I suppose, would be the preferred option around this time of the year. And I suppose kind of, we should kind of come away from the idea of the contractors coming, I should empty every tank that's in the yard and get value for money. Yes, you probably will get value for money and get your slurry empty, but are you putting out and after the slurry, extra slurry on ground, that potentially might be able to take it because of poor grass growth or that kind of thing this time of the year. So I just be a word of caution on that. Maybe it's kind of reduce the amount of slurry you spread. Obviously, slurry needs to be spread to make room for the rest of the house period, but use it kind of sparingly would be the preferred option.
Most definitely, there is great value in the slurry, Niall, for sure, and farmers have seen a very dramatic increase in the price of fertiliser over the past number of years. What prices are expected in the coming year for chemical fertiliser?
It's kind of, I suppose, kind of crystal ball stuff, but I suppose kind of recently there, I was doing a bit of work, just kind of inquiring from merchants about the price of fertiliser. Look, it has slipped back a good bit from, January of last year to January of this year, like, and somewhere behind, the 18,612s or the 27 2.5, 5, 24 2.5, 10 are kind of maybe the main fertilizers used in dry stock farms, and they're kind of retailing in around 500 a ton, maybe up to about 530, 540 a ton, kind of give or take, depending what part of the country you're in. Nitrogen has come back a bit, all right. You're looking at sort of the protected urea is kind of retailing in around 560, 570 a ton. The standard urea back about 500 a ton. So look, I suppose it has come back, which is obviously a positive thing, from the beef perspective, because fertilizer is a big bill on farms, but it's still a long shot off going back, for a couple of years ago, maybe pre-pandemic times when fertilizer was a good bit cheaper than what it was even today. So that's why it kind of emphasizes my point, to use slurry to your advantage. If you take soil test results and it indicates that you have a high phosphorus index reading on your farm, you mightn't have an allowance to purchase in the likes of the 18,612 on your holding. So then the only source of nutrient or the only source of phosphorus that might be available to you is through your slurry, so just use it wisely and try and get good use out of it. And I suppose, just before we move on a bit from slurry, I suppose on spring calving suckler herds, the grazing block around the sheds or whatever, it might be the dry piece of ground this time of the year, and you might be kind of a tendency to get a lot of slurry to relieve pressure on tanks. If a lot of slurry goes out in grazing ground in the springtime, and you might be letting, freshly calved cows out the grass in month of March or whenever it's going to be, a ground that has received a lot of slurry obviously has a lot of potassium in it, and that high potassium level in ground can cause grass technique, especially in fresh calvers. So just bear that in mind as well, that just maybe turn down the dial with the slurry and that kind of thing when you are looking at putting out slurry on the grazing block.
Most definitely, Niall, it's something to be aware of. And finally, you mentioned there about the stocking rate of 130 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. How do farmers find out what their stocking rate level is? Are they at the stocking rate or above or below the 130 kilos that you mentioned?
Yeah, I suppose there's a few different ways you can check it. I suppose, sometimes there in your nutrient management plan, your advisor would have put in your stocking levels that are on your farm, be it suckler cows, 0 to 1s, or whatever the case would be. And that will give you a planned projection of what your stocking rate is going to be for 2024. Alternatively then, you can log on to your ag food account. Most farmers would have an ag food account at this stage, and you look for the nitrogen and phosphorus statement. Now, usually these are, they're historic, so it's based on last year, previous couple of months stock numbers, and that will tell you your organic nitrogen per hectare, will say, on your farm. But it's only for bovine. So, for example, if you're a farmer there and you look up your results and it's come in at 120 kgs of organic nitrogen per hectare, and you have also got an enterprise where you have 50 or 60 ewes, for example, you could very well be gone over the 130 kgs of organic nitrogen per hectare by having, a few different enterprises on your holding. So just bear that in mind when you do look up the nitrogen and phosphorus statement on your ag food account. It's only for bovine only, not any other enterprise that might be on the farm. So, and again, obviously, you could talk to your local advisor as well, who would help you out on how to figure out what your nitrogen limit is, and where you sit for the coming season.
Thanks very much, Niall. That's great advice, and really the first step will be taking soil samples in the coming weeks before slurry is applied.
Absolutely, yeah. This is the time of the year to be looking at them things now, and I suppose maybe it's important as well just to reiterate, and farmers that might be involved in acres as well. It's mandatory that they take soil samples, so this is the time of the year to be getting on that bandwagon now and getting that job done before the season progresses into calving or slurry season, which is just around the corner on most farms.
That's great. Thanks very much, Niall.
Thanks, Catherine.
That's all for this week's episode, and my thanks to Niall for joining me on the show. You can catch up on all other shows and interviews from the Beef Edge podcast on the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie, or you can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe so you never miss a show. For more other updates from our beef programme, keep an eye on our Twitter and Facebook pages. Until next time, I'm Catherine Egan and thanks for listening.